Morning. Thank you for joining us today. Nice to have you all here. So I will be recording the session so we can share it at a later time, and I'll let you know where that is for those of you who'd like to see certain elements again. We're talking today about the bounce back, what to expect, how to plan for it better, and how to prepare ourselves in commercial terms, marketing, product portfolio, some of the issues we need to be thinking across as we go forward. For those of you who don't know me, I've been in Asia since 1992, so I've lived through a number of the shocks that have hit the market, including SARS and the swine flu, the Asian financial crisis back in '97, the global financial crisis. So I've seen some of the impacts of these historic events on the economy and on consumer behavior. This, of course, is a little unprecedented in that it's like combining the SARS in the Pearl River Delta with a global economic crisis and then spanning it out across the whole globe. So the impact is very hard for anyone to have a prognosis and a forecast on. But that's what we're trying to do here today. So perhaps a little brave in our forecasting, but we're trying to help clients particularly understand how they can better prepare going forward. For those of you that don't know Simigo is a consumer market research agency helping clients work on innovation, communications development, branding, customer experience through all sorts of different tools that we would deploy to understand consumer insights. We've got a number of participants today from our Indonesia client base and also our Vietnam client base, so thanks for joining us. A quick recap. We, of course, have CLT space across the markets, focus groups, communities that we run, online panels, quite a strong field force in each market. And we also have in Indonesia 8 different offices, and we have 7 offices in Vietnam. So we're doing lots of work, lots of consumer contact. Today's I've turned into a presentation. Many of you would have read the blog, but the presentation you can find here on the website. So you are welcome to download it. If you would like to use any of those slides internally, please feel free to do so. So what I'm going to run through today is, first of all, the major points that are presented on this slide, which is really some of the things to expect and some of the things to be planning for, and certainly from a marketing, advertising, and promotion budgeting point of perspective, how can we better prepare those budgets and the budget allocations we have therein. So we'll be looking at what potentially could be new in consumer behavior, when we expect consumer expenditure to bounce back, and for those of you perhaps who aren't expecting a need for it to bounce back, maybe explaining a little bit why there'll be a shortfall for some time. Understanding how we can better appeal to a consumer who we believe is going to be far more thrifty, far more price conscious going forward. Looking at some of the obviously shifts in shopping channels, budgeting, and how to make our communications relevant, and perhaps what not to be doing during these times in our communications. So an evolution of new behaviors. So there's a lot of hype online, particularly in social media, about a new normal, which suggests that everything's going to change, and that the old pre-pandemic scenario for all of us is never going to return to how it was. I don't prescribe to that diagnosis, but I do prescribe to the fact that there will be some evolution in behavior and some adjustment in behavior. The reason for that is obviously that we've been forced to change our behavior over a short period of time. For some of us, 3 or 4 weeks, for some of us a little bit longer. And of course, if you have consumers overseas, it really depends on the market they're in to the extent that they've been under lockdown and the period that they've been under lockdown. But even as things are opening up, and they've opened almost to normal in Vietnam, you're still under lockdown in Indonesia. There will be constant reminders of what a virus and a disease might look like, and why we need to adjust our behavior in terms of how we greet people, most simply, Most of us will have stopped shaking hands and probably will continue to do so for the remainder of the year. We'll be reminded in terms of perhaps distances that need to be kept in restaurants, shifts in gyms, our schools won't be back for some time, limitations on travel and other events. So there'll be a constant reminder beyond the short-term lockdown that we have experienced in Vietnam and that you're currently experiencing in Indonesia. Obviously, there'll be other reminders such as public events, sports events, concerts, and so on being put on hold. I don't prescribe that there's to the idea that there's going to be revenge spending sprees as soon as lockdowns are over. In fact, I think the re-emergence of consumer expenditure will be much more slow, much more steady, and we're not going to see a sudden rush back to stores, to events, to restaurants, to bars, and to a return to pre-pandemic lifestyles. It's a little bit of a fantasy, and China so far has proven that to be very correct. You know, China's opened up, closed earlier than anywhere else, has opened up earlier than anywhere else. And if we take malls as an example, then they're still operating at maybe 30% footfall of what they were pre-pandemic. So you can see that you know, visits to public spaces are very much curtailed at the moment, despite the fact that there's no longer a requirement by the authorities not to visit. So obviously, for each of us, we need to understand, well, how is this going to address our category, impact our consumers, and impact our business, impact the way people shop, the pricing they're looking for, the packaging they're looking for, and the way we speak to them and message to them. We've all, whether it's webinars such as today, the way we're socializing, the way we entertain ourselves, the way we shop today while we're on the lockdown or have been recent lockdown, we've all seen new ways of working, new ways of socializing, entertaining, and so on. And some of those we might like, and we might want to keep a little bit more of. Some of them we'll be quite happy to be rid of, I'm sure. So new rituals and norms, we need to keep it a little bit in perspective, because if you read a lot of headlines in the marketing press, you would imagine, and probably the marketing emails we're all receiving, you would imagine that actually the way we knew the world and the way our consumers interacted with our brands and products has changed forever. That's not true. Things will be adjusted. There's not a complete new normal. For a great read on the subject matter, Mark Ritson is quite outspoken, uses a lot of foul language, I'm afraid, but he's quite an outspoken Australian marketing academic, practitioner, public speaker, and he's written quite a good piece there onto that link as to why things won't change forever. A good example of that is, you know, if I listen to my competition talk about the changes that are going on, yes, people are buying more household products, more personal cleaning products and hand sanitizers, and they say things like, well, when everything returns to normal, definitely I'm going to eat more at home. I'm not going to go out so much. I'm really enjoying the cooking. I'm going to do much more of that. Well, that's easy to say when you're being surveyed during a lockdown. When you're back to your somewhat normal lifestyle, rushing to and from work, organizing children, being time pressured, then of course consumers will need convenience once again, and that need for convenience will reemerge. And in both markets, consumers know that it's often cheaper to eat out than it is to prepare food at home, unless there's a very large group. So it's easy to say during an event like this that my behavior is going to change in consumer surveys, but reality we need to be aware of is that as life starts to return to normal, that those changes will become less and less needed and less wanted. So we have to take due consideration and a sensible, smart perspective when we look at the way consumers tell us what they're doing now and what they expect to do as their lives can return to normal. We do expect, of course, behaviors will be adjusted, and some of the things that we do now we enjoy, and that's fine. And of course, there will be economic stresses on many households going forward that will also force further changes beyond those that I've talked about already. I would like to ask you all a quick question. So I'm going to put up a little poll, which is, if you look at the business that you're working for or you're running, what do you expect to happen to your revenue this financial year in 2012, this calendar year, sorry, 2020? So to what degree do you expect it to change? You might need to scroll down because there are some of you that might expect business to increase, or you may expect business to stay the same, which of course is perfectly acceptable. I'm just going to give you a moment to respond to that. It's nice to see a few people expect business to increase. Okay. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to stop the poll now, just and share the results so you can see them on screen. In our estimation, if a market such as Indonesia or Vietnam has been closed for 3 to 4 weeks, given the time and the uncertainty leading up to that closure, so many of us would have closed our offices and worked from home prior to the official lockdown, and given the slowness that people return to spending their hard-earned dollars, and the uncertainty that surrounds such a huge event as this, we're expecting that any business in Vietnam or Indonesia, assuming the lockdowns are over in Vietnam and are not going to go over a month in Indonesia, then we're assuming that most businesses will lose between 24 and 36% of their annual revenue. That's over a quarter of companies' annual revenue and tax returns will be lost in this financial year. So the impact that has on employees and therefore consumers will be quite dramatic in reducing the money available to people, whether it's being given time off, taking unpaid leave, having their salaries reduced, or even losing their jobs. And for many businesses in both markets, the small micro businesses which have been closed, and there's no fallback for those businesses and those business owners, and that revenue is really lost. So we can expect quite a significant impact. And what I'm seeing here is that basically most of the responses are ranging somewhere between 11 and 40% in terms of what you expect to happen to your revenues over this time, which is a significant drop and therefore will affect, I suspect, nearly every single category and the consumer's ability to access in an affordable way those categories. So I'd like to go from that negative to the extreme positive and just remind ourselves, for the audience coming from Indonesia and Vietnam, why we're probably in 2 of the best markets in the world for a bounce back. And that is because both economies are extremely strong, extremely digitally connected, and have large domestic markets of significance. Indonesia far more so than Vietnam, but even Vietnam's economy and population is well placed. And they're well placed for a long-term uptrend. And I don't want to lose sight of that because too much of the current conversation online and in the press is the negative consequences. But when we look around us globally, then these are 2 markets, thankfully, that should rebound quicker than most. I'm not going to read through all those numbers for you. They all refer to 2019 data. And they give you a sense of what's going on in the different markets. In this case, it's Indonesia. Let's look at just high growth, 5% GDP growth last year, and income per capita, or GDP per capita, sorry, of just over $4,000 US. and a domestic economy that is extraordinarily strong, and stronger than the Vietnamese economy in terms of its domestic demand. And that's important for the bounce back for Indonesia. If we look in Vietnam, we've got a per capita GDP of 3,000, a slightly higher growth rate at 7%, significantly higher perhaps, but also very strong retail sales, very strong increase in domestic tourism, good advertising market, and a well digitally connected market. And for those of you who've heard me speak about the demographics of Vietnam before, our productivity rate in Vietnam for the next 10 years, purely driven by the low number of dependents and the working age of the population, suggests that the next 10 years on the pre-pandemic circumstances would be extremely strong. But it bodes extraordinarily well for the bounce back, and I don't want to lose sight of the positive aspects of both these economies and their demographics and their digital transformation represent going forward. That said, it's not going to be a sudden revenge spending and a sudden shift and an immediate return to what it was before we all learned of the city called Wuhan and its virus. Both countries have a very optimistic, very opportunistic, very entrepreneurial spirit in the way that people go about earning an income and look for multiple sources of income. But to build the bounce back requires momentum. It is very much a long run, like a marathon. It's not a sprint of 100 meters. So when we look ahead at what's going to happen, we don't see consumer expenditure, that's the spending that any household in either market makes, will return to its pre-pandemic levels for at least 18 months. It will gradually return over those 18 months, but it will only get back to what it was after 18 months, assuming their lockdowns are not extended or there is not a relapse, i.e. a relapse, more cases emerge and we go into a second lockdown in Vietnam's case, or a longer lockdown in Indonesia's case at the moment. It's very different from SARS and swine flu. So one, both economies are far more connected globally than they were during SARS and swine flu. But post SARS and swine flu, a lot of research was done, and I've looked back at that research, and behaviours really did not change significantly. The comeback was relatively quick, and the outbreaks were relatively, compared to today, in a small geographic scale. Of course, what we see now is global. It's a containment that's global. It's quarantines. It's closing of borders that won't open for many months to come. It's social distancing, more so in some markets, particularly Vietnam than perhaps Indonesia. And the economic impact is still very much a guess. Well, for some of the smartest minds in the world, it's very much a guess as to what the true economic impact is going to be. For us, we've made an assumption when we've looked at how consumer spending is going to change and when it's going to bounce back. We've made an assumption at the bottom of the page there that GDP in both of Vietnam and Indonesia will remain, GDP growth will remain positive, i.e. there will still be growth. We don't expect there to be growth in many markets in the world, but in these two markets, we expect there's going to be growth. In Vietnam, we're expecting 2.7% growth versus just over 7% last year, and Indonesia just under 2% versus 5% growth last year. So, and part of the reason for that are all the issues I just went through for both markets and looking at their economy, their demography, and their digital status. So what I'm showing you is, or what I will be showing you, is how we expect consumer spending to come back, taking into account essential expenditure, so housing, health, education, food to feed my family, and discretionary expenditure. We've also factored in a drop in essential expenditure, i.e. people having to cut back on what they would normally consider essentials. Discretionary expenditure, for example, is going out to eat, going out to travel, going out to shop for non-essential items, cigarettes, alcohol in Vietnam, eating, dining, cinema, gyms, anything that is considered non-essential expenditure. And really we're looking at the rate of change that we expect those to come back to pre-pandemic levels. I have one more question for you, which I will ask now, which is to take on your view as to when you think your sales will return. So this is your sales, when you think they will return to pre-pandemic levels. Is it Q2 of 2020, or is it, if you scroll down on your poll, in my case, I need to scroll down. Some of you may think it's far later, into 2022 or even 2023. Thank you for taking part and voting. Makes it interesting, I think, for everyone else. Of course, it is anonymous. I can't see what you're voting, and I won't be reporting any of these votes either. If I look at this, I'm going to close the voting now. We're at nearly 80% of the voting. Sorry if I've cut you off, just from an interest of time, everyone. You can see that most people there are looking at Q4 2020 or Q1 2021 in terms of when they expect. So that's nearly half of you expecting sales to return to what they were pre-pandemic, either at the end of this year or early Q1. In our modeling, and so the modeling that we've done is based on the GDP numbers I've talked about, and it's also done on a lot of assumptions, building into what happened post other financial crisis and other major events such as SARS and swine flu. Just stop sharing those results. So if month 0 is the period, the month that lockdown is in place, and we expect expenditure to drop by 49%. We expect it to build to 68% in month 1, and then at month 6 to build up to 85% of what it was pre-pandemic level. At month 12, 92%, and then a small minority getting into between month 12 and month 18, so the following 6 months before it really returns to pre-pandemic levels. And this is really relevant for general consumer goods. Of course, every category is very different. So there's certain categories right now that are enjoying increased sales, such as personal wash and household cleaning items. Would be good examples of categories that are enjoying a increase in consumption, and even perhaps people shifting from lower cost brands to more premium brands with a better antibacterial type promise. But there are a lot of categories where that's not being experienced. Some of the food and beverage categories are very hard to comprehend because of stocking up at home, and they will take a while for the trends to become apparent. But of course, many categories will be slower than others, given their nature of social distancing, and also partial constraints placed on them by authorities over time. So really 18 months before we see general consumer expenditure returning to what it was pre-pandemic levels. And there's some key target groups that will have the most significant changes in their behavior. One, of course, of those people who are most at risk. So we see the level of concern naturally being far higher for the people in their late 50s, 60s and above, and that really increases quite dramatically. There are quite important groups in terms of the level of disposable income, discretionary expenditure, and they're extremely important for inbound tourism for both markets, but more so Vietnam. There's another area that you see a lot of behavioral shift at major events, and that's people who are experiencing a life stage change. So young adults who are finishing university or about to start university, when they have a behavioral shift that's been forced upon them, as in a lockdown scenario, that is far more likely to create new permanent behaviors because of the life stage they're going through. People who are married in both Indonesia and Vietnam, the time between marriage and first child is on average 6 months. It's a major life stage changing moment. A lot of new behaviors are experienced. And of course, people who are experiencing those things at the moment are far more likely to see their temporary behaviors being changed into molded into a new normal. And then also families where their children are leaving home and they're becoming essentially empty nests. These are key life stages where changes will become more significant. And on certain categories, they'll have a huge influence. Insurance will be one for the second group there. But in many categories that will be dependent on certain life change moments, then these are really groups that I would want to be investigating from an insight perspective. If I were in those categories. Of course, we're talking about 18 months for general consumer expenditure. There will be some slower comebacks or bounce backs for certain categories, depending on the constraints of physical or social distancing that the authorities apply. Some of this is far more pronounced in Vietnam than Indonesia. In Indonesia, the compliance, if you like, with advice on social distancing is far less stringent than it is in Vietnam. So some of the changes that I'm talking here are more pronounced in Vietnam than they would be in Indonesia. But distancing measures will be a constant reminder. If I walk into a cinema or a school, for example, and I have so many seats per area, or a restaurant, or gyms start putting in shifts to limit the number of people able to access the gym at any certain hour. Some of those constraints will mean that expenditure for those categories will take longer to return. Domestic travel. So domestic travel, Indonesia is an exception because of some unique holiday events. Idul Fitri is being missed, which is, for those of you who are Vietnamese, it's like an equivalent enthusiasm for that holiday as there is Tet, and for returning home to my family's original home, if I've migrated to a city at this time in late May, would be absolutely phenomenal. So they may well see domestic travel take a spike if they come out of lockdown. When they come out of lockdown, as people try and catch up with family on what they've missed because they've been on lockdown over that holiday period. But generally in domestic travel is going to be constrained for some time. A lot of it not necessarily authorities providing the constraints, but attitudes of consumers providing the restraints. The more adventurous and outgoing and perhaps younger may be happier and more flippant in their attitudes and happier to travel, happier to get on long distance buses, trains and airplanes. Others won't. Others will be far more reserved and will take a wait and see approach. Given that people's wallets are going to be very stressed, their financial position is going to be stressed, some other categories of high value purchases will be delayed and pushed back. International travel, it's unknown when borders will open again. I would imagine that borders for intra-Asia travel will open long before they allow Europeans and Americans and Brits, particularly to enter some of these markets, because I would imagine much of Asia is looking at those countries and not being too impressed with their control of the virus, and quite concerned about inbound passengers coming back to these markets. That's also going to restrain MICE, is just incentive travel, exhibitions, conferences, meetings, also international students, which is more of an outbound experience for Indonesians and Vietnamese. So it's going to take different levels of time for certain categories to evolve. That means, of course, you're going to have consumers who are going to be far more thrifty than they have been. And for those of you that have been in consumer marketing over 10, 15 years, you're going to have to think back and think, well, what were some of my strategies to make my products more accessible to consumers who are lower income, and bring in some of that thinking back to the table if it's left the table already. Or another way of looking at it, well, some of my portfolio that might be geared to a more rural consumer where a cash outlay is more of a consideration than say in a larger city. I might need to start readdressing some of that in urban areas because people will be financially distressed. Disposable incomes naturally are going to be impacted. Tourism is a big contribution to GDP in Vietnam and also jobs, and a lot of small and micro businesses, more so than Indonesia, but will definitely be impacted. Manufacturing will impact both markets. The PMI index for both markets have seen significant, as you can imagine, drops in March, and it's going to be far worse than results come out for April at the end of this week. And then, of course, we have the demand for those that are export-led manufacturing businesses, which would impact both markets, but Vietnam more predominantly than Indonesia. Domestic consumption will be suppressed as people have less money. That's certainly a bigger issue in Indonesia, where the domestic market has a bigger contribution to GDP than within Vietnam. Both markets, because of all those economic, demographic, and digital issues I spoke about earlier, I think will continue to be very attractive options once people are less panicked by what's going on, and FDI will probably continue to support foreign reserves for both governments. But spending will be suspended beyond necessities, and people will be seeking greater value. And really the key things to think about are people will trade down. Where people have historically, over the last 15 years, mostly premiumized their purchases, mostly, not all, people will start to reconsider and will start to look at choices that provide them better value. So, for those of you with portfolios, you might be wanting to look at some of your value for money offers and products, and expect those to eat some of your sales from your higher value offers or your higher price offers. People will shop more frequently in smaller quantities, we believe. So they'll be looking to conserve their cash. Price sensitivity is important, but cash outlay at times like this is often more important. Where people are having their incomes reduced, or members of their family have lost their jobs, or their businesses are not generating revenue, then price outlay, cash outlay, trumps, bad use of the word in current times, is more important than price sensitivity. So you should look at essentially smaller packaging, single serving type options for people to be able to access your products at a lower price point, maybe with a smaller quantity. Of course, there will be affluent consumers who are largely unaffected, maybe unaffected, not all, but there will be some, and they will also be seeking value, but they'll be doing it at the other end of the spectrum, looking for something in bulk or multi-serve. Consumers will go out of their way for low-cost channels. So in both markets, the online platforms are often beating convenience and supermarket stores in pricing, largely subsidized by the funding that sits behind them. But consumers will go out of their way to seek lower pricing, and they will travel further to get better pricing. And they'll be paying far more attention to promotions. So if your competitor's giving a value promotion, you're likely to lose that transaction if it's going to be offering value. It's a very tough balance not to devalue your brand with constant promotions, but you need to look at ways of adding value to your customer's purchase to attract the sale without damaging your brand equity over the long term. Most of you have been in marketing long enough to know that, and will have experienced different ways of addressing that. Other things when people are feeling thrifty is, well, if I can't overindulge and comfort myself readily and easily because my finances won't allow, then how can I reward myself? How can I have a little treat? Some categories will do very well in providing small treats, small rewards, and indulgences that essentially bring comfort and reassurance. Think comfort food, think chocolate in the Western world, but think whether it's a bubble tea or whether it's a small treat with a low cash outlay. These things can be very important and very useful in promotions also. Just thinking, I'm just going to just take a little pause and see if there's any questions that anyone wants me to address. I can see one there, which is predicted bounce back timeline for the education sector and how the current behavior change to online learning. Will it stay? I don't believe online learning will stay. It will, there'll be certainly more acceptance of it, but it will be very much, I would imagine, from the providers. If you're talking about non-curriculum, non-school curriculum education, I think from the private, for example, language or other private forms of learning, then certainly more hybrid versions might become acceptable. The predicted timeline is really, really hard to address because we just don't know when the authorities are going to ease up and actually allow learning centers and curriculum type schools to return to normal. But my guess is that if you're talking about private education, then it is still going to take 18 to 22 months to return, because for many of the private education spend will be deemed as non-essential spend when people's financial pockets are stressed. I will come back to the other questions over time. Okay, brand equity campaign versus price promotion campaign I'll be addressing very shortly. Yeah, if everyone's doing promotions, aren't promotions just going to devalue the whole category? There's also another question. Yeah, getting promotions right is absolutely a challenge, and running promotions that don't devalue your brand really takes some creativity. Not everybody will be running promotions. Some people will do straight price cuts, discounting, pretty poor quality level of thought going behind the promotions. Other people will look to provide value for the consumer at ways that do less value to the brand and less value to the category. But yes, certain categories will be stressed and stretched by those over-promoted activities. There's not a lot you can do about it, except be extraordinarily agile in your approach to those markets. Just quickly looking at shopping, I know there's obviously there's people far more equipped to talk about shopping habits than us. I think they're still really understanding their own data in terms of retail audits and so on. But some of the issues that you can definitely expect to see is that people have gotten to an experience when they haven't always had that experience with certain environments. So they've had to try new channels because essentially they've been forced to, either the inability to travel or to travel far, or the need for using online services has enabled people to experience things in certain categories that they may not have experienced in the past. And some of those changes, much more so in Vietnam than Indonesia, may become far more permanent for people if they've enjoyed the experience and had a good experience. So online shopping is an obvious example. A lot of people have tried online shopping for the first time, or have tried it for the first time in a specific category, and may have had a good experience, and may decide that they are quite happy to continue with that experience. People also in Vietnam, I would say, will be far more ready to avoid high traffic environments. So wet markets, convenience stores, which can be seen as high traffic environments because of the fact that you have to walk into the stores and interact with people, whilst neighborhood stores, mum and pup stores have far less interaction, far less touching of product shelves, door handles, and so forth. The Indonesian attitude is being far more lax, so maybe it's going to be less significant in terms of the change, but I imagine the online experiences will have increased for many and in many different categories. In both markets, shopping behavior at malls is strange. It's mostly F&B related and experience related, and it's a social venue. Whilst that's understood, I would expect people to be visiting high traffic environments such as malls less, and the malls are really going to have to work very hard to provide more experiences for consumers that are unique to drive up that foot traffic. And we've seen that in amazing levels in China, and not just in Wuhan, but in many cities in China, where the malls are really struggling to get consumers to come back in at the moment. They're getting there, but the levels of footfall are still significantly behind what they would have hoped to achieve. Okay, supermarkets, it's kind of hard to tell. There's no consistency in their data because of the stocking behavior. They're probably going to be net gainers though, in that they, relative to convenience stores, they're far more spacious, and there's far better controls over temperature checks and sanitization in entering those stores than there is in convenience stores. Somebody asked about the marketing budget allocations, and this is really what this next section looks at, which is what is the ideal communications mix and how does that change over time during this bounce back? So empirically, we know that brand building versus sales activation is typically 60% for brand building and 40% for sales activation. And this is not empirically from Simigo. This is from people who are far smarter. There's been a lot of studies done on this. If you look on the Simigo homepage, you'll see an article called The Great Brand Malaise. And if you read through that article, you can see the empirical data and links to the empirical data there. So if that's a starting point, then what should we expect to do going forward? How do we recalibrate that? Brand building, building my equity around my brand versus running promotions, activations, anything that essentially gets a consumer closer to the conversion point of buying me, whether it's trial, whether it's visibility on a mobile app or a shelf or a menu. We need to look at how we recalibrate in that light. So remember that most businesses, we believe, will have lost between 24 and 36% of their annual revenue in 2020. And that will trickle down to employees and the consumer base. So if you're looking at, first of all, this homebound period where you're on a lockdown or partial lockdown and consumer expenditure is very much depleted, not only because of the availability of cash, but also because of the ability to go out and shop. And during that period, we're really looking at things moving between 51 and 67% of pre-crisis spend. If you're available online, well, of course, this is a perfect opportunity to be pushing sales. You might be available online because you're on online platforms, but you also may be providing delivery services. You may be a streaming service. There are many, obviously, examples, but in those examples, you would want to be increasing your budget during this period and making the most of providing access to people. And we would suggest that your AMP budget, your advertising and promotion budget, is nearly double a multiplier of 1.8, and that most of that is shifted to sales activation. So you're paying a premium to be higher up on the page. You're paying a premium to stand out on a page, and you're putting in promotions that trigger people to buy and activate a sale. brands that aren't readily available online, then it's a real challenge during this lockdown period. Obviously, also consumer attention is not very strong towards brand marketing at this point. People have other anxieties to be concerned about, in which case you should really be spending very little and decreasing your expenditure and putting most of that in brand building, because the sales activations aren't going to be very helpful for you. If we then look to things opening up again, which is where we are in Vietnam, just starting now, but those of you in Indonesia can start to look forward to that soon, I hope. As outlets begin to reopen, obviously you need to address plans. And assuming there's no relapse, there will be more assertive and adventurous consumers and segments that are willing to spend money. So again, we would suggest that at this time, your promotions should be your budget should be far higher than normal, if you can. And that again, your emphasis on sales activation should be far stronger at 80% and brand building just at 20%. Because this is a time where you really want to offer value to people and you want to push conversions and sales. And you also want to be spending ahead, you want your share of expenditure, share of voice to really be ahead of your competition if you expect to maximize the sales opportunity in this time. If we look at months 4 to 6, so it's sort of getting into a steady pace, expenditures coming up, maybe 70 to 80% of pre-crisis consumer expenditure. Here the adjustment can start to be less strong, but you're still looking at brand building being only 40%, sales activation being at 60%, and a multiplier of 1.6 to keep you ahead of your competition, and to still attract through sales activations those who are having budget limitations and feeling thrifty. As we go into months 7 and 12, from things reopening and getting into a specific pace, we can expect consumer expenditure to be 85 to 90% of pre-crisis consumer expenditure. The multiplier can be less, and now we're looking at brand building to sales activation being equal in their ratio of 50-50 spend. And then this is the last on this topic. As things start to return closer to what they were before, month 12 to 18, and really finishing the adjustments that you're going to be making to advertising and promotion budgets, you're back at brand building being at 60% and sales activation being at 40%. And of course, during this time, your portfolio, your branding issues, your packaging sizing, and the pricing that you can provide for consumers will have evolved, one would hope, and the opportunities that were there by changes in behavior would have been leveraged. I see there's a lot of questions, so I'm just going to refrain from continuing to the next section, just have a look at those questions. Ali, I hope I've answered your questions, but you're happy to contact me if I haven't.
Richard, there's a question from Indonesia on the chat. Vita is asking why we think that the travel and tourism industry is going to take longer to recover, up to 24 months.
Why? Okay. So if you think about a adoption cycle of any consumer group, you have those that are more assertive and more adventurous, and you have those who are more conservative, and you have those who are really quite laggards and would quite happily wait and see what's happening. When you have such a scaled event as this and a pandemic as this, there are going to be a lot of consumers who are very concerned about what they do, or parents about what they allow their children to do, or other dependents who are older to do. So a lot of people have seen that travel has been a key transmission point for the virus. And there's, whether it's a cruise ship or inbound returnees bringing back the disease from overseas, and people are naturally very cautious about airplanes, airports, and high traffic environments. So beyond that, you've got the openness of borders. So domestic travel, particularly in Indonesia, might be different because of people being a little upset that they're having to miss seeing family over the upcoming holiday. But I would suspect it's going to take quite a while for attitudes to shift and the cautious end of the population or the conservative side of the population to be comfortable traveling again. And hence, getting back to 100% of the spend that was there pre-pandemic will take a significant amount of time and much longer time than in any other category, is our belief. The other constant reminder of the limitations and anxieties around travel will be when international borders open. You know, I don't know when that will be. None of us do. And I suspect it won't be the same for every nationality, but I suspect it will be prominent in the news when different countries start opening up and will be a constant reminder to people about the fear of travel. So that's why we think that travel is going to be a much longer in its bounce back than many other sectors. It's also one of the key areas of discretionary spend. So it's something that can be delayed, suspended, or completely missed. We won't have a holiday this year, we'll wait till next year because finances are stressed. There's a lot of great questions here. Let me just, what's the trend in the banking industry? Are we seeing, do we expect the same for services? So yes, we expect the same for services. We don't think that the banking industry is suddenly going to be doing extraordinarily well whilst consumer finances are stressed. There are certain sectors in the financial services industry that might do better. Some areas of health insurance might do better. Some areas of payday loans might do better, and unsecured financial loans might be helped by this scenario. Sorry, I'm just having a look at another question. When will people, it's wedding season in Vietnam, that's a good point. When are people going to restart having weddings? Will they downsize or delay? Okay. Yeah, there's going to be administrative limitations on weddings for some time in terms of the number of people allowed from the authorities. So, but I would imagine there's quite a lot of pent-up demand for weddings to be rescheduled. But I would imagine they will be smaller affairs than they might otherwise have been for the current time. And Tyrone, thanks for your comment. In terms of corporate travel, may be permanently affected. Yes, yeah. I mean, we've all I agree. We've all learned to use different tools, but perhaps we realise now that I didn't have to travel to that office and spend a day getting there and a day getting back. I could have done it all on Zoom. So we're getting more comfortable with technology and helping us achieve that. That's certainly true. There are more questions. I will carry on for everybody else's sake and then sort of address those at the end. I want to talk about communications because you're probably like me in that you've all received a lot of communication and a lot of emails saying our CEO has a message for you and all this sort of thing. Most of it quite contrite, sort of falsely looking at empathy whilst trying to remind me that they've got a product to sell me. And then if we look at consumer advertising on television and streaming, it's been quite shocking. This is an example which I've given the link there for you. I'm not going to show it all. I'll show it quickly so you get the sense of it. It's a bit long, but I would urge you to have a look about really an example of how not to communicate in current times, and then I'll explain why I feel that way. Okay, I'm not going to go on forever, but I do urge you to watch it. But obviously, a time like this, people are feeling anxious, insecure, concerned about family and friends, missing family and friends, and so on, worried about their future income and their businesses. And yet the advertising just serves predominantly to remind people of how miserable life can be under lockdown and how uncertain things are, which is completely the wrong thing to be doing at a time like this. What consumers need to be at a time like this is entertained, uplifted, inspired, not to be reminded of how miserable life can be, and to be reminded that there's a corporate out there saying, yes, I understand it's tough now, or in these times it's so difficult, and we're there for you. Those sort of communications are very uninspiring and really not doing anything to build brands or build sales. It's very disingenuous to suggest that you're there for them through difficult times. No one really wants to be reminded that times are difficult. What they do want to do is be reassured. They want brands to be supportive, to be comforting, yes. Reflect on how we can show gratitude for and what we have awe towards. Highlight the fact that we belong to our social group, our immediate family, and perhaps larger groups and larger communities that we might belong to, even nationalistic. And of course, be inspiring in terms of looking forward and looking ahead to a brighter future. These are all messages that would be far more empowering and enjoyable for an audience. So, it's a time to be uplifting and positive. It's a time to be entertaining, to introduce humor, to be inspiring, and not to move away from the basics of brand advertising and start saying, well, we understand how difficult life is for you at the moment. A good example, here's one from Colgate, of how to do it right. I'm going to stop it there, but what Colgate does in terms of Smile Strong is take real life scenarios of people speaking to each other on Google Hangouts or Zoom or whatever platform they may be using, FaceTime or whatever it is, and being true to their product. They're talking about having a great smile. So they're getting their product across, and they're getting the right branding messages across, and a very strong emotional message, because I would imagine most of us and most of our consumer base have experienced these moments where they're having to speak to loved ones through these devices. And it's a reminder to us all of how, how important family and community are to us. So they've done a very good job of not actually mentioning any of the negative aspects about what's going on, but stuck to their product story, stuck to the emotion, and delivered it in a very simple, relevant way for the time. So that's an example of how to communicate correctly at this time. But going back to the basics, it's be inspiring, be uplifting, be entertaining. Don't remind me of misery, in essence. So that's really drawing to a close for me. I will take Q&A, but it's coming up to the top of the hour. But new rituals and norms, some of them will be permanent. The whole idea of a completely new normal is fallacy. The whole idea of there being a complete immediate bounce back and revenge spending is a fallacy. For most categories, it will take around 18 months for things to return to what they were. Everyone's going to be far more thrifty. It's just a reality. People are going to be seeking small indulgences and comforts to help them through a difficult time. In both markets, we were seeing a huge shift to online shopping already, and that's just going to be accelerated. budgets need to be adjusted, and certainly the ratio between brand building and sales activation need to be adjusted. And communications, try and be uplifting and be true to your brand and your product. Don't draw consumers back into anxiety, reassure them and inspire them. Just remember before we go to Q&A why both markets are so well equipped for a bounce back. And despite the fact I'm saying it's going to be 18 months, I'm from England, it's going to be far longer there. It's going to be far longer in the US, it's going to be far longer in most of Europe. So we are in the better markets. All of us who are living in both of these markets, we're in a far better place than many people and many others. So we should be very thankful for that because of these fundamentals. And that's the same fundamentals that you've seen already for Vietnam. What I've just presented, it's not rocket science, it's just a perspective, drawing on experiences and looking at consumer expenditure bounce backs over time. You can download it here if you want those slides, feel free to use it. The real content is here in the blog, but if you want to use any of those slides, you're welcome to, you can download it there. Tung or Edwin, maybe you could just help me if there's any questions that I need to respond to.
Yeah. Hi Richard, we have questions from Vietnam. From Ms. Hoa, like which category do you think would see the significant shift to online?
You know, for example, baby care and baby food and infant formula already was going strong, will have just suddenly gone a lot stronger. That's an example of a case being accelerated. There will be cases where people are getting more comfortable, which will be normal grocery shopping. So grocery has had a real challenge in Vietnam anyway to attract online shopping behavior. And if you look at some of the initial data coming out of some of the platforms, they've of course seen huge upswings, of course. Not all of that will stay, but it will enable a shift as people realize, well, wait a minute, that works. And wait a minute, the pricing's right. And wait a minute, I quite enjoyed the delivery aspect of that. So I think for a lot of these platforms will have recruited new users or new users in new categories.
Okay.
Any others, Tom?
I think we have one question related to the real estate industry. So do you see any trends in the real estate property, maybe not only in the key cities, but if we have some information, some trends prediction for the new emerging province? So
yeah. So I mean, I first of all, that's Vu, right? Before I answer that, Vu, I am not a real estate expert, so let me just caution with that. You'd be better off speaking to CBRE and Savills, but I think a lot of people will be suspending any decisions they make on property sales and property acquisitions. And of course, a lot of developers will be trying to push for next stage payments. And there'll be a lot more intense competition to get interest in. Your question really is about what about developments outside of the key cities? You then have to ask yourself, well, who is buying those and how much of their income is being challenged and stressed? So by each province area, you might want to be looking at, okay, if a lot of the people in this area are making their money through textiles is going to be pretty suppressed for a while. And there's a lot of layoffs happening and a lot of salary reductions happening already. You know, if it's another industry, then the scenario may be a little bit different. If it's people buying second homes, or it's people from overseas looking at investments, or if it's people trying to park their money, I would suggest that's going to be a very slow build and maybe a good 24 to 30 months before that really comes back.
Yeah.
Hey, Edwin, any from Indonesia? Are we all good?
No, I think we're good from Indonesia.
We're good. All right. Well, listen, thank you everybody for attending. I appreciate that. If you enjoyed the event, please feel free to send us a comment or add something on LinkedIn, would be even better. Feel free to download the presentation. And if you have any questions and I haven't answered your question, If you write to ask@simigo.com, that'll reach me and I'll get back to you. Well, have a great holiday weekend. For those of you who are in Vietnam enjoying it, and for those of you still in lockdown in Jakarta and beyond, then I hope you find some good movies to watch. Thanks again.